Hey guys, so it's Sherlocktober. Want to join Skippy and I in reading some Sherlock Holmes stories? What do you think? Hey booktubers, welcome to Sherlocktober. So this is a read-along hosted by Steve Donoghue, and each week we're reading the various short stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I think the first 2 weeks we read 6 short stories, then week 3 we read The Hound of the Baskervilles, and week 4 we finish up with 5 short stories. I'm going to be using this book for the most part when I'm reading my short stories. This has 37 short stories and 1 complete novel. It also has the 356 original illustrations by Sidney Paget, which appeared in the Strand magazine. It is paperback, so it's not too bad, but it is a little cumbersome to carry around. It doesn't contain, unfortunately, all of the short stories that we'll be reading. So when they're missing from that particular volume, I'll turn to my Barnes & Noble leather-bound classic. This actually has everything in it, all the short stories, all 4 complete novels, but it is a bit cumbersome to carry around, so I'll pretty much only be using that when necessary. And then, even though both of those contain The Hound of the Baskervilles, I actually have a small little paperback for that. This is the Penguin English Library edition, which would be a lot more convenient to carry around. Now, in addition to reading all these stories, I also kind of want to watch a production of each episode as I finish it. And so I'm going to be turning to Granada Television, which produced a great collection of all the short stories. I think they contain all of them. And it stars Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes. To me, he is the ultimate Sherlock Holmes. After seeing various incarnations of him portrayed on TV and in film, he definitely fits the bill perfectly as Doyle described the character. So I have actually the entire set on DVD. I've got the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, The Return, the casebook, and also the feature film collection, which I'll be watching for Hound of the Baskervilles. You can actually find a lot of these episodes on YouTube. I kind of just, out of curiosity, typed in the search bar the title of one of the short stories, and it popped up, the full complete episode. And I did that for several of them to see, and there are quite a few. I'm not sure if all of them are on there or not, but yeah, if you're interested in watching them and you don't have a set of the DVDs, or just for convenience sake, if you just want to pop up on YouTube, they're there. They're commercial free, and yeah, get your chance to watch Jeremy Brett if you've never seen him. I highly recommend it. So yeah, on to week 1 with the first short story. To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irena Adler. All emotions, and that one in particular, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. I really enjoyed The Scandal in Bohemia. It's a different short story for Holmes. It's not a mystery full of clues that he has to solve, but it's more him trying to outwit his opponent. He's hired by the King of Bohemia to recover a photograph that includes him with another woman, and this other woman has threatened to reveal the photograph if and when he announces his future marriage to another woman. It's sort of her way of seeking revenge for kind of him before promising marriage to her, and now, promising to marry someone else. He has tried everything to get this photograph back, and now he's turning to Holmes. What I like about it is this is not a success for Holmes. In this particular case, he is outwitted by the woman. In terms of the Jeremy Brett production, it's not his production, but him starring in the role, I think they did a really great adaptation of it. It stayed very faithful to the original short story, and I really, really enjoyed it. On a side note, the character of Irena Adler has also appeared in novels of her own as the main character. Apparently she was very popular with fans, and it kind of carried on her storyline in her own individual novels. I've yet to read any of them, but if any of you have read any of them, let me know if any of them are really good. Next, I read The Red-Headed League. This is the story of a Mr. Jabez Wilson. He's the owner of a pawn shop, and his business hasn't been doing too well. He can only afford one apprentice who was willing to accept half wages.
Now, this apprentice makes him aware of an article in the newspaper about the Red-Headed League, a league created by an American millionaire, and he has created this to kind of help people in the town where he was raised in England, and he's focused mostly on red-headed people, I guess, like himself. So his apprentice convinces him that he'd be a perfect candidate for it, especially with his fiery red hair, and he goes to interview for the position and is immediately accepted. This position pays £4 a week, so he's definitely, willing to accept it. It's for nominal services, which he comes to find out means he will be copying down the Encyclopedia Britannica, beginning with Volume A. He gains quite a bit of knowledge as he's going about this service, but then after, I think it's some like 8 weeks or so, suddenly he goes to work one day. His work includes being in the office from 10 till 2. He cannot leave it, or he will lose his position and lose the money. But he goes to the door and finds that there's a sign on it that says the Red-Headed League has been disbanded. No other word, cannot find anybody to tell him where these people have gone, what has happened to it. So he turns to Holmes. And Holmes and Watson, upon hearing this story, kind of burst out laughing, which he doesn't find very amusing. But if you're reading it, it does sound rather silly, the whole idea of a red-headed league, and his main job is to just copy the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's obviously something more to this story. And Holmes becomes intrigued. He likes stories that are absurd like this, and it piques his curiosity. So it was overall a pretty good story. I didn't find it particularly one of my favorites, but it was still intriguing to find out what was going on with this particular red-headed league. I watched the BBC production with Jeremy Brett. Again, it stays very, very true to the main story, including some of the illustrations you see within the book, and I'll include them here. The dialogue is very, very exacting as well. But there is one glaring difference on the TV show. They mentioned Professor Moriarty, Holmes' main nemesis. He's not mentioned at all in this particular short story, so I don't know what the reason was for that. Perhaps they wanted to bring that character in fairly early on the TV show. I don't exactly know why, but they made it sound like he was behind all the events in the Red-Headed League, so that was the intriguing difference of it. But on to story number 3.
So the man with the twisted lip finds Holmes and Watson kind of encountering each other in the most unusual place, an opium den. Dr. Watson has gone there in search of a missing patient at the bequest of his wife. When he's there, he discovers the man, but he also discovers Holmes, and he's quite shocked. And Holmes he has a little chuckle. He says, "I suppose you thought I've added opium to my cocaine addiction." But Holmes is actually there in disguise, searching for a missing man as well, and also at the request of the wife. So the two set off on this sort of journey to find this missing man. It's believed he has been murdered, and the person locked up is a homeless beggar who has this twisted lip, hence the title of the short story. I thought it was very good. Also, the DVD episode that I watched was very exact to the book as well. I don't have a whole lot to say of it. I thought it was a fairly good short story overall, but nothing that really stood out very much for me. So The Blue Carbuncle is a story set around Christmas time, and it seems like a little lighter-hearted story at the beginning, not a serious crime of murder that has taken place. Instead, a commissioner brings Holmes a goose and a hat. And the situation involving how he came to it is kind of interesting. It's like 4 o'clock in the morning. He's returning home from some sort of celebration from the holidays, and he stumbles across an elderly gentleman carrying a goose and a band of kind of ruffians that are bothering this old man.
They knock his hat off, and the man, fearing for his life, he raises his cane behind his head and accidentally breaks the shop window behind him. At this point, the commissioner runs to lend assistance, and they all think he's the police, and everybody takes off, leaving just behind a hat and a Christmas goose. On the goose is a note that says, "For Mr. Henry Baker," and the hat has the initials HB. Well, he doesn't know what to do with these items, and he'd like to return them to this older gentleman. So the only thing he could think to do is to bring them to Holmes. Well, Holmes quickly sends Commissioner Peterson home with the goose before it starts to spoil, saying, enjoy it for your family for a Christmas meal. And he's left studying this hat when Watson shows up, and he tests Watson's observation skills, see if he's learned anything from having worked with Holmes for a while, and he doesn't get much from the hat, and yet Holmes starts to reveal all these clues that he can get about the owner of the hat based on what he sees on the hat itself. And it's really fascinating, what he can see. It doesn't seem to be much left afterwards, because there's no way they're going to find a specific Henry Baker in the confines of London, Baker being a fairly common name. And everything seems to be finished until the commissioner returns, having found something quite remarkable within the goose. He finds a jewel. It is, in fact, the missing jewel, recently reported stolen, called the Blue Carbuncle. And suddenly this situation takes a whole nother level. It's an interesting story, too. I like the way not only does Holmes use his intellect, but he uses his wit to kind of solve the crime, tricking people into revealing information. And it also, you see a bit of more compassion, I guess you'd call it, in terms of the outcome when he discovers how the jewel came to be within the goose, and who was responsible for that, and not really worried about seeking justice or getting this person arrested for the situation, because it wouldn't really solve anything. It would turn this person into a jailbird for life, when it was just sort of a kind of a, how do you call it, just an instant situation when he decided to do this. Not a lifelong criminal, but it would turn him into one probably if he was arrested. So he says it's not his job to do the job of the police. For him, it was just to solve the mystery. That was what intrigued him the most, and to return the property to who it belonged to, and also to free an innocent man who was locked up. But at that point, that's all he was concerned with. But you see a little different side to him at the end of that particular story. So I thought it was pretty interesting. The Speckled Band is one of my favorite short stories. This particular one, we have a young woman who sees Holmes because she's absolutely terrified about the circumstances in which she's living in. She and her sister were living with their stepfather, and in a rather kind of run-down, stately home. And he's changed a lot since their mother died, and he's become a real harsh man. He has a strange band of gypsies living on the property. There are ferocious animals roaming around, including a baboon and a cheetah. He's very rude and mean to anyone that even tries to approach the property or the neighbors. And he's pretty strict with them as well. And recently, within the past year or so, her sister died under very strange circumstances. She had mentioned hearing some strange whistle coming from the room, but her sister wasn't able to hear it. Her room was situated between her sister and their stepfather on the ground floor. And then one night, she heard a terrible scream and rushed out towards her sister's room, where she sees her coming out. And she falls to the ground in convulsions and says something about having seen a speckled band, and then she dies. So it becomes this weird sort of locked room mystery. The rooms are all shuttered to the outside, and the sisters have always bolted their doors from the inside as well. And it seems like there's no possible way someone could have gotten to the sister. There were no signs of poison or physical wounds anywhere. And now, for some strange reason, the girl's stepfather has done construction on the home and breached the wall to her bedroom to the outside, so that she must now sleep in her late sister's room. And she is absolutely terrified, and Holmes is immediately intrigued. There's a definite element of danger and sinister feel throughout the story that I just absolutely loved. And seeing Holmes pit his mind against this stepfather, this doctor who had worked in India and brought these strange animals back with him, and what caused him to change his behavior. Yeah, it was just a really, really great story that I really enjoyed, and they did a great job of it on the Granada television series as well. So, yeah, one of my favorites. The Copper Beeches is the last short story we're reading for week 1. For those of you who aren't familiar with the short stories, they're narrated by Dr. Watson. He attends Holmes on these cases and jots down all the facts and things like that, and then writes them up in these stories, which Holmes, he kind of wishes, I think, that Watson doesn't sensationalize the crime so much as focus on the logic needed to solve the crimes. He feels like in a way that they trivialize what he does. And because of that, I think he sees a lot of his cases being sort of trivial ones lately, including the one that sets off the story for the Copper Beeches. He's recently received a letter from a young woman by the name of Violet Hunter, wishing for his opinion on whether she should or should not take a position as a governess. He feels like that's what his practice has come down to, something as trivial as this. But it ends up being something much more within the story, which often is the case with these. It seems like something like minor point, a lost goose in a hat, turns into, a jewel thief, a jewel theft. So, yeah, it starts out something small and just builds and builds. But, yeah, I think he's seeing his practice kind of taking a bit of a nosedive here, and it's come down to this. But it still is a pretty interesting case where this woman comes to him to find out whether she should take this position or not, because there's some strange things that go along with it. First of all, why this particular gentleman who's looking for governess for his young son is willing to pay so much more than she's earned for other positions. It's almost something that she can hardly bypass. But then there's some other little things that go along with this particular position, that they may ask her to wear a certain article of clothing or sit in a certain location within the room. All this sounds a bit odd, but okay, sure, why not? She's being paid well for something like this. But then one of the stipulations is that she should cut her hair, and that she sort of draws the line. And he's like, well, you've apparently made up your mind already. But then she comes back to say that she's received another letter from this gentleman after her initial refusal, saying that he understands that she may find this difficult, but he's willing to pay even more. He offers her more money. At this point, she can't hardly refuse. So again, he says, well, I don't see what you need me for. You've made up your mind, but, if anything odd or anything further should come up, just contact me. And then it does. It gets a little bit more strange, where apparently someone is watching the house, and there may be someone else in the house in a secluded room, and things get a little bit more odd. In fact, the nature of the man that hires her goes from one extreme to the other. It can be extremely pleasant, and then when she stumbles upon this locked room and he sees her coming from there, he's very harsh with her, and even threatens to set the dog on her. There's a vicious dog in the yard. So it was a pretty interesting story. I like the way it begins with us kind of this discussion of how he feels his practice is kind of like going to trivialities and stuff. But the ending of the story was kind of interesting too, because he comments, well, Watson, I should say, comments at the conclusion of everything as to, he says what happens to all the various characters, and he says, as to Miss Violet Hunter, my friend Holmes, rather to my disappointment, manifested no further interest in her when once she had ceased to be the center of one of his problems. I'm kind of curious as to what sort of interest he thought Holmes would have in her after the case was solved. Did he mean in a romantic sense? There was no indication of that within the story, and definitely never any indication of that coming from Holmes. So I don't know what he meant by what further interest he should have in her. So if anybody else has any thoughts on that, I'm curious. But yeah, that was a week 1 conclusion of Sherlocktober, and so on to week 2, where we'll begin with the Adventures of the Silver Blaze. So hope you guys enjoyed this little vlog, and I'll be back next week.